No.
Okay, turn your phones up.
In this week's parsha, we find Yaakov Avinu returning from the galut, from the exile, entering the land of Israel. The events we read last week in Parashat Vayishlach are to inspire and guide the Jew how to live his life in the exile. The realities of the exile are presented. We're going to be dealing at times with difficult personalities. At the same time, the reality of the people of Israel is such that we gain a lot in the exile. We always are, we could call national accomplishments take place outside of the land of Israel. We turn into a nation in Egypt. We get the Torah outside of Eretz Yisrael. Our mission of reaching all the nations of the world, having the ability of communicating and understanding different cultures, that does not take place in the land of Israel, but it takes place due to the fact that we were present on all corners of planet Earth. So Parashat Vayishlach is there to teach us about the exile. You know, there's an interesting statement. The Rambam, in the laws, where he talks about the responsibility an employer has. So there are many lists. There's a whole list of responsibility. But the Rambam ends that chapter by telling us that you should know that the worker has a responsibility as well. And the Rambam ends the chapter by telling us that chayav, that the worker must work bechol kocho, with all his might. He has to put all his energy into his task. And he tells us that if you want to know why Yaakov HaTzadik, the righteous Yaakov, merited to return to the land of Israel at the end of Parashat Vayishlach with such wealth, was due to the fact that he worked hard. He was righteous because he was an honest worker. And therefore, as a result of that, he is labeled Yaakov HaTzadik. It's interesting that we always, children develop this image of the tzaddik being a person who is immersed in text, immersed in spirituality and prayer. Perhaps so. But we have to remember that you can get the title of a tzaddik, of a righteous person, of being honest in the workplace. That if you have a job and you took it upon yourself to go ahead and do something, you do it. And that is actually part of the mission of exile. We interact with society, we interact with the world. We have a job to inspire the world. The way we inspire them is by living by specific values. We have something beautiful in the news in the past 24 hours. If you haven't seen it yet, go home, not now, and look and do a search for Rabbi finds $98,000.
On Craigslist.
A rabbi, somewhere in Connecticut, purchases a desk on Craigslist, brings it home and takes it apart to be able to place it in the room he wants it in, and as he's taking it apart, he finds a bag. And he sees some dollar bills, and he opens it and he finds not one, but $98,000 in it. What does he do? He calls the woman and he says, by the way, the desk you sold me, the $200 desk, it happened to have in it $98,000. And she says, oh my gosh, that was the inheritance or whatever it was, my savings. She was extremely impressed, and thank God the media picked up. It's about time that we get something positive with someone with the title Rabbi, finally. And the media is covering, and I reached CNN. And it's Baruch Hashem. Now the Kiddush Hashem, he has achieved the Kiddush Hashem that is worth much more than $98,000. And he is indeed fulfilling that mission we have in exile, to interact with society, and they say, you know what? It is based on Jewish values that he is ethical. And in the short 2-minute clip you could see on YouTube, he was very sure to have on his desk the Gemara, which is indicating through symbolism that it is based on those teachings that he is a person of character and value. That's what we are supposed to do, and that's what Parashat Vayishlach is about. Jew, do the right thing in exile. Be honest, and then you're fulfilling your mission. This week's portion is talking about entry into the land of Israel. And it starts off, it immediately tells us that the first thing Yaakov wants to do before he enters is get permission. He informs his brother. And he sends messengers with gifts. And he sends them with the message of him being subservient to his brother, recognizing the fact that he values the relationship with his brother. The news comes back with the fact that he is coming with 400 men. He prepares for battle, prepares for gifts, prepares to appease him, prepares through prayer. Fine. So that's what the portion is about. So the rabbis immediately, the rabbis in the Midrash note that this perhaps, say the rabbis, was not the wisest thing to do. If you are afraid of dogs, note the rabbis, don't pull the dog's ear. It's a smart word, Jewish wisdom. That sounds more like a Chinese teaching, but Jewish wisdom here. You don't like dogs, don't pull the dog's ear. And what the rabbis are saying is as follows, that technically speaking, we are talking about at least 20 years, perhaps even 34 years, after the events that took place with Yaakov taking the blessings of his brother. It is very possible that he could have made an entry without Esav having any knowledge of the fact that he is back. It is very possible that his anger has subsided over time. He nevertheless goes ahead and he brings up the matter. Not always a wise thing to do. So the rabbis on one level are critical of his decision. On the other hand, there must be a reason for it. So the commentators note that when the patriarchs act, they act as rational beings. There's no question about it. But at times, they work with some kind of sixth sense, a feeling that what I am doing now is valuable, perhaps not for today, but to establish a pattern in the future. These are people, and this is a generation that recognize that what they are doing is having an impact not just on themselves, but they are establishing a pattern. We always hear of this concept of ma'aseh avot siman lebanim, that the actions of the forefathers of the avot and the imaot are going to have, in effect, are creating a future pattern. And therefore, Avraham in Egypt has a sense that it is a good thing to take the gifts that are offered, because he knows that in the future, or he senses that at some time in the future, he's going to have descendants in Egypt, and if they leave with wealth, the status will be much better. So these are actions that are not based on the logic of the time, but some kind of feeling that it will be necessary in the future to act in this way to establish a future pattern. What is taking place here is Yaakov is making the following, establishing the following for the future. After the 40 years in the wilderness, we enter into the land of Israel. The journey into the land, the actual entry into the land of Israel was not done by an El Al flight, was not done by boat, and was not done by just crossing dry land, but rather they walked through the Jordan River, like a Kriyat Yam Suf. We actually visited that place, or is not so far from that place when we were there close to 4 years ago. Now, or was it 3 years ago? So, the entry was supernatural. The way they fought and they beat representatives of 31 nations. 31 nations had representatives and probably armies in the land of Israel. How were they able to succeed? How were they able to beat them? This was not a natural entry. It was supernatural. To have the right, to have the ability to fight on a supernatural level, you have to be on a high spiritual level. You are on a high spiritual level. You have a Yehoshua as a leader. You have a priest that is walking around with a breastplate that could communicate with God. Perhaps then you can have an entry into the land of Israel. The question is, what happens in a generation when we are no longer on that spiritual high? When we no longer have prophets, when we no longer have Yehoshuas, and when we no longer have Kohanim that could communicate with the Almighty. What happens then? Are we going to have the ability to ever enter without being on that high level? So what Yaakov establishes by sensing that it is the right thing to do, is to create a pattern, to create for the future of the people of Israel the ability to enter into Eretz Israel, even if they are not on the highest spiritual level. And how is that achieved? That is achieved by being granted permission. It's happened when they entered after the Babylonian exile. The Jews are exiled after the destruction of the first Bet HaMikdash. They are exiled to Babylonia. 52 years later, they begin the process of a return, completed 70 years later. How do they enter? This is not a nation that's on a high spiritual level. This is not even a nation that is united. Most Jews do not return. But the few somehow are able to return and begin the process of rebuilding a temple. How do they do it? They are granted permission from Koresh. Cyrus gives them permission. They are able to go ahead and do so. This was established by Yaakov asking permission, and he is teaching. He is teaching and establishing this concept. You could enter with permission from the nations. That too will be done. Do not think that we only enter if we are on a supernatural level. You know, there are the halachic system in general is a very traditional system. In other words, you're not going to go ahead and find someone claiming that he is working within the halachic system, but nevertheless, I will ignore all teachings that I've heard in the past. The whole definition is a system that is handed down, slight adjustments that take place due to realities, but they're not going to be fundamental changes. At times, we have leaders who sense that the times are different, that something has changed. Realities have changed. Great leaders. Unfortunately, these great leaders quite often appear and make statements that are what I could call sad statements, negative statements. Someone that senses that there are sad times ahead of us. For example, in the temple in Jerusalem, in the Bet HaMikdash, for hundreds of years they had the Holy Ark. The Holy Ark contained the luchot, contained the tablets. The most significant vessel we had in the Bet HaMikdash. It was always in a place called the Holy of Holies. For years upon years. Comes a king of Yehuda, a king called Yoshiyahu, and he is presented a book, the book of the Torah. It's open, they find it placed where the tochacha, the admonition is there, and he meditates for a few minutes and he says, you know what, guys? We got to conceal the Holy Ark. I ask him, why do you want to conceal the Holy Ark? It's been there, my grandfather had it there, my great-grandfather had it there. Who are you to go ahead and change the location of the Holy Ark? He says, listen, there is a chamber, there's a hiding place, a tunnel under the Holy Temple, and this tunnel was placed there intentionally by the builder of the temple with an understanding that there might be a time that it has to be concealed. Now is the time to conceal it, because I sense, unfortunately, that an exile is coming. He sensed it. So he goes ahead and he changes a tradition, and this is a tradition that dates back to the wilderness. There too, the Holy Ark was in the Holy of Holies. But he sensed that times are changing, and you make an adjustment. And according to one school, the reason the Holy Ark was concealed and never taken into exile was simply because he sensed a shift has taken place. Greatness. Another person that fit that mold, the ability to sense that times have changed. Close to 2,000 years ago, the Second Temple is destroyed. People are very disturbed, but they are hopeful a rebuilding will take place. A rebuilding will take place soon. So, there were people that had the obligation to bring gifts to the temple, like birds in some cases. A woman who gave birth wants to bring these birds' gifts. So what they would do is they would set funds aside, and they would put it on a shelf, and they would put a little note there and say, hopefully when the temple is rebuilt soon, we're going to go ahead and take those funds and purchase a bird. That was the norm after the destruction of the temple. There was a feeling that very soon it will be rebuilt. Comes Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and he declares, you know what? Stop doing that. Because I have some news for you. We're here for the long run. There's no rebuilding taking place. The reality is now that we're going into an exile, an extended exile. And therefore we have to have commemorations for Jerusalem. The shaking of the lulav that was done only one day, do it 7 days now, throughout Sukkot. According to Torah law, it's only one day. Do it for 7 days to commemorate the fact that in the Beit HaMikdash it was done for 7 days. He establishes a system with an understanding that there has been a shift, a major shift. It takes guts, it takes a vision, and it takes a great leader who has the ability to make such a declaration. Now, the same greatness was actually presented on the positive side in 1920. What happened in 1920 after the Balfour Declaration? So the nations gather in San Remo and they declare that the land of Israel indeed should be given to the people of Israel to establish a Jewish home. Fortunately, God, with his great sense of humor, decided to create this need for oil at that moment. Right then he had to do it, right? He couldn't wait a few decades, but Ribono Shel Olam provides oil for the Arabs and everything turns upside down because from that moment on, what the nations have been trying to do is backtrack. That's been the history of the 20th century. But nevertheless, in 1920, the nations of the world grant permission for the Jews to return home. Fine? Comes, and we've quoted him here often, Rav Meir Simcha Dvinsk, a rabbi in Latvia, right? And he goes ahead and he declares, this is a shift. What do you mean by a shift? He said, up until this point, there has been a concern by some that as individuals, you are allowed to make your way to the land of Israel. As a nation and as a group, you don't. There was such a school based on a statement in the Talmud that we took an oath not to rebel against the nations. So he notes, there were those who were concerned with that statement up until 1920, up until now, that perhaps as a group, we should not go ahead and push to establish ourselves in the land of Israel. Now we are granted permission. Now we have, just as the Jews had when they returned during the Second Temple period, were granted permission. Now we have permission. There is a shift. There is a change. And now, up until now, when you would ask a Jew what's considered a significant mitzvah, so he would say the study of Torah, teaching people about mitzvos. Now suddenly, the significant mitzvah what we should focus on is establishing a Jewish presence in Eretz Yisrael, working the land. A shift. That was a greatness of a rabbi. And those who tuned into him did a wonderful job and indeed playing a significant role in establishing not just the state of Israel, but those who followed based on rabbinic guidance established a spiritual state. And whatever spirituality we see there, we have to give credit to those people who had that vision. So this is a person that senses a time has changed. And indeed greatness, but indeed the concept is rooted back right here. Yaakov gets permission, Yaakov asks permission. Yaakov realizes perhaps that for his time it was not the wisest thing. Perhaps it was unnecessary. But to establish a pattern for the future, he needs to go ahead and teach. And he needs to establish the idea that at times we return home based on... It's okay.
I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry. Give an opportunity to stop a little bit.
Don't turn it off, I like it.
He is granted permission, by the nations. Now, it's always interesting that when you read material about the state of Israel, and I'm reading now the Prime Ministers, which everyone read, an excellent work. It's one. I shouldn't be telling book clubs what to read, but if a book club would ask me what would be a good book, I would say that the Prime Ministers would be an excellent one to discuss, because there is so much there.
Are you offering to moderate it?
Yeah, if they would ask me, I would even do that. I don't think there are professionals who could write reviews here, right behind Murray. You can see one, a professional, but. I would be more than happy to do that. In any event, when it talks about the different prime ministers of the Jewish state, the shift that occurred in 1977, the significance is one that is unmeasurable and one that he points out on so many levels. The difference between Ben Gurion, Golda Meir, Levi Eshkol, Rabin to a Begin. a different ball game. He's a different being. But the most significant one, and there are on many levels you could focus on the difference between them, but the most significant one is the question, how do we view our ability to have a Jewish state? Is it the nations of the world with their good grace are going to allow us to exist? Or, no, they're not going to allow us to exist. We have our roots here. It is our land. And we're going to make it clear, we're not going to hold back one iota. And that was Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin had the ability to sit down with Jimmy Carter, the ability to sit down with Ronald Reagan, and to go ahead and spell out, he would not hold back not one iota. That, this is our land. No, these are not occupied territories. They're liberated territories, right? That's what be Menachem Begin. Without holding back one iota. They did not know how to deal with him. Now, they did not know how to deal with him. When on the other hand, the philosophy, and this is a philosophy that predates the Jewish state. If you would analyze in the 1940s, as they are fighting the British, the philosophy of Weizmann and even Ben-Gurion was a belief that eventually the nations of the world are going to grant us a state, so let's just play with them, let's play ball with them, and if we play, we'll get it. And Begin believed they are never going to give us a state. You want the British out? There's one way to do it. You know the King David, right? We'll take care of it. We'll blow it to pieces. That's how we'll get them out. And of course, historians, based on their agenda, are going to present facts in a different way. There are literatures and books you're going to find out there that are going to claim that Begin gets no credit for the fact that the British packed up and left. And there are others, in my humble opinion, the ones that are closer to fact, that the reason they left is because they were scared and they ran out. The Brits, with all due respect, right? They're limited with their guts. Now, in any event, not for these, no, they're hardworking leaders.
Unlike the French.
So now, with that, what we have to remember, and what we're being taught here, is the idea that even if we Baruch Hashem have leadership that understands our roots in the land, leadership that understands the fact that this is a land that's given to us and we have no right to go ahead and believe that this is something that the nations gave us, but it's a gift from God. Even with that approach, there has to be the understanding that we are still in an era of negotiations. And even Menachem Begin understood it, that we have to interact. We cannot ignore the world. We cannot allow our concern for public opinion to damage our security. God forbid that. But at the same time, there was always an awareness that we have to play ball with the United States, we have to play ball with, and nowadays, unfortunately, with the Russians and with the European community. Playing ball does not mean giving in. It means that you have to know how to present it. And that's the take that we have from this portion. We have to communicate, we have to negotiate, because at times we have to get the permission from the nations of the world, which we are taught here. But this portion can be identified as the portion of the second Beit HaMikdash. If Koresh grants permission and we enter into the land of Israel, and it finds its roots in this week's Parsha, and as a result of the roots found in this week's Parsha, we have a second temple. There are going to be, that's what I'm going to present to you now, the similarities or concepts that make their appearance in this week's portion that eventually become significant during the second temple period. And I'll give you examples. The Ramban notes that when he hears he is under attack, what does Yaakov do? Vayachatz et ha'am asher ito. He divides his nation, he divides his family, lishte machanot, and he declares that if God forbid, if Esav comes and attacks one section, the other one will survive. Comes the Ramban, Nachmanides, in the 13th century, and he says that you should know we are establishing a pattern here that you do not place all the Jews in one place. Until the Messianic era, you're not going to have all the Jews settled in the same place, but rather they're going to be dispersed. And if God forbid, there's a pogrom in Spain, so there are Jews in Germany are going to be safe. And when there's a pogrom in Russia, there are going to be Jews in the Americas that are going to be safe. That is something that is established, notes the Ramban, based on this statement. Now, when did that happen? When were there indeed Jews throughout the world? During the first temple period, there was no such thing. The whole Jewish nation was present in Eretz Israel. After the destruction of the first temple, Jews are dispersed. The bulk moved to Babylonia. There are many who make their way to Egypt. And there are some who make their way all the way to Yemen. The Yemenite Jews who returned after the establishment of the State of Israel were present there from the destruction of the first temple. They never returned. They never came. The benefit they had is they always kept up communications. In other words, that even post-rabbinic Judaism, even rabbinic Judaism they were familiar with. They were in touch with the Rambam, so the writings of the Rambam reached them. Some of their communities even got the Shulchan Aruch. They were always in touch, and therefore halachically they had zero issue with their return. The Falashas, the Ethiopian Jews, had unfortunately a little bit of a gap. So therefore, even though the poskim say they are Jewish, but it was a discussion due to the fact that they did not keep up communication as much as the Yemenites. But the idea is that Jews were present in all places on planet Earth. This is Second Temple period. We always talk about Hillel, a big hero in our tradition. The man that was committed to Torah, that he would lay on the roof of a study hall to tune in to the teachings, even though it was freezing cold, and we know what that is. That's Hillel. Where was Hillel from? Hillel was Hillel HaBavli. In other words, his family was from Babylonia. He comes to study in the land of Israel, but he was from a different area, a different region. So this idea of the nation of Israel splits, not everyone in the land of Israel, that's a second temple reality. And now, if you go through the portion, we have unfortunately the story with Dinah, daughter of Leah, taken by a local authority. And we know, and this is something we're going to discuss, the Hanukkah story has that as well. Because during the brutal control of the Syrian Greeks, Jewish daughters were taken by them. They had a decree that the first night has to be given to the local ruler. These are very unfortunate events that find their roots in this week's Parsha as well. And now, what I believe is the strongest is the idea that when eventually they have to deal with the city of Shechem, and the fact that they took Dinah, who are the ones that take it upon themselves to free their sister, wipe out the city? Shimon and Levi. How does Yaakov react to the fact that they didn't just take the daughter, but actually wiped out the city at the same time? He is critical of them, claiming that I'm going to have to deal with society. But they're not into practical politics. They are into ideology. If they believe that it's the right thing to do, they'll do it anyway. They are zealots. They are the zealots. And being a zealot has its role, can indeed serve a very significant role, but God forbid if such an approach is misused. And if you look at the story of the Hashmonaim, they were zealots, but they used their zealotry in a very positive way. You know, I talked about the disbursement of the Jews throughout the world. Recently, in the media, they had Jewish artifacts from Iraq that were found in the palace of Saddam Hussein. How did he have? Now, he was no Torah scholar. Why does he have Jewish books, Sfarim? Why did Saddam Hussein have them? So, when he took over the country, he destroyed synagogues, and when he destroyed them, there were items that looked valuable, old books that were 200, 300, 400, 500 years old. So he took them, and they were sitting somewhere in his personal collection. So now the United States, of course, has them because George W. Bush took over Iraq. And there's a little bit of a debate. The Iraqi community, the Jewish Iraqi community, claims that it's theirs. And, you know, they're probably right. It is theirs. It shouldn't belong to the United States. And so there's a discussion and a debate about it. Now, what's interesting is that some of those communities, some of those shuls that Saddam destroyed in 1968 have their roots, listen carefully, to the period after the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash. Jews went to Babylonia. They settled there in areas called Surah. In an area called Surah, Jews were present from the time of Ezra, from the time really even beforehand, from the time of Yirmiyahu Navi. Yechezkel had his prophecy there. And there was always a community, a very large one in the 11th century. In the 11th century, when European communities, Jewish communities in France, had a couple hundred people maybe. In Mosul and in cities in Iraq, there were 40,000 Jews. Right? We talk about European Jewry of the 11th century. I'll talk about Rashi with such pride, and you think that France is the center of the Jewish world. That's not the case. The case is that in the 11th and even in the 12th, it was in Iraq. And there was a presence even after that. And there were tremendous Torah scholars in Iraq throughout that period of time. There is a Jewish presence outside of the land of Israel, starting after the destruction of the first temple, throughout the second temple period, up until Saddam Hussein. And therefore these artifacts are really connecting to a period that's gone. And I hope they do land up, I'm sure, let the Iraqi communities have their fight, which one of them gets it, but nevertheless I don't think it belongs anywhere but there. That's the idea, that the Jewish world is dispersed, and that's the second temple period. And then the Hanukkah story, the Hashmonaim, is one that makes its appearance as well. Another element, Israel, over the last 2 decades, over one of the hot issues had to do with Mihu Yehudi. I'm sure you've heard the idea of what exactly defines a person as Jewish. So this is an older question, predates, it goes back to the days of Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion, in the language itself used by the Knesset, was a bit vague, which was wise. Politicians sometimes, the greatest decisions are not to cross every T, because you could satisfy everyone by leaving things a little bit unclear. But over the past 2 decades, as so many Jews made their way back from the Soviet Union, there has been several questions, because there's a percentage of those returning that perhaps are not halachically Jewish. So you're familiar with the matter. When we talk about percentage, what's the percentage? So it all depends who you ask. What I always feel, awful for those who are, you could feel bad for all of them, but when people have to defend their Jewishness, it's not comfortable, it's not easy, it's difficult. There's actually a project being done here in Toronto where people of Russian descent could go ahead, and remember, so many people you meet here are going to tell you that they've been in Toronto for a decade, they were in Israel for a decade, and beforehand in Russia. We've met many people that have gone through that journey, and some of them have to deal with others questioning their status. Extremely painful, extremely uncomfortable. So there's an organization now, there's a movement to try to record that those who are confident, but just don't want others to ever question, that they could get some kind of document that proves without a doubt that there is no longer going to be any questions about their status. So that's what's trying to be achieved. The Mihu Yehudi. So a lot of them have to do with questionable, the question if the mother was Jewish or not. There are some situations where there's a question about conversion. And you hear at times voices claiming that this is the greatest challenge for the people of Israel, right? That we have people fighting in the army when you don't even know, when they're not going to be perhaps buried in a Jewish cemetery. Painful indeed. New? Not at all. During the Second Temple period, during the Second Beit HaMikdash, you find in rabbinic literature, over a period of hundreds of years, a discussion and a debate about the Kuthians. About the Kuthians. What exactly were the Kutim? What are these Kuthians? So, as Jews are uprooted from the land of Israel, towards the end of the First Temple period, the king, right, Nebuchadnezzar and Sancherib, bring nations from other locales. They go ahead and bring nations from different regions and place them in the land of Israel. A brilliant way of taking strong control of your empire, because when people don't feel that they have roots to their land, they're not going to be willing to fight for it. Now, this is another interesting point, that during the 1948 war, many Arabs left their villages, right? Hundreds of small villages. They evacuated. Why did they leave? So we know that the Arab armies were telling them, many of them, not all, many of them were told, leave. we're going to wipe out the Jewish state, and then you could come back. Right? That was their agenda. Some of them left because they were fearful, there's no question. There were incidents that they were scared, no question about it. The majority of them left because they felt, we can come back. And there are those that did not feel this attachment. In other words, the attachment that we have towards the land. This is a land that has been ours, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, 3,000 years, right? Begging, declaring, I don't need the world to tell me Jerusalem is the capital. King David already, when he moved from Hebron, that is the capital. We are people with roots. When you have roots, then indeed you're willing to go out and fight for your land. When in your DNA you're a Bedouin, right? What is a Bedouin? You settle one area. It's no longer convenient for whatever reason. So what do? You pack up and you move to the next place. It's a very different approach to land. And that's what happened. This is an explanation that's given, that when it came to the quote-unquote Palestinians, that they so easily left in 1948, you know why? They didn't feel this attachment to the land itself. They had no roots. Then, of course, when the world puts them in refugee camps, and you don't let them become part of society in either Jordan or Syria, and you have the United Nations and the world telling them, don't you feel bad that you lost your home? So then they'll find an old rusty key and claim that I'm holding on to this key for 65 years, that I want to return home. But the roots they actually did not have. This is a statement that's made. You could debate it if you want, but there's some logic to it. That was the logic of Sancherib and Nebuchadnezzar, that when they uprooted nations, they take these Kuthians, a different region, they place them in northern Israel. They are part of the empire, but they know that these are not people that are going to rebel against my empire, because they don't feel an attachment for the land. So what if my land is controlled by these Babylonians? It's not really my land. But what happened was that these people were attacked by lions. Lions were roaming and they were attacked. And these are superstitious, or call them spiritual people. And they realized that we can't live in this land, northern Israel, if we are attacked by lions. So how do we do it? How do we deal with it? It must be that we must connect with the God that is in charge of this land. Who was the God in charge? The God of Israel. They convert to Judaism. Mazel tov. They convert to Judaism, but for the next hundreds of years, the rabbis are not sure, was this a real conversion? In other words, were they really accepting the values and the teachings of Judaism? Or perhaps they just converted because they don't like lions, and it was a conversion due to lions. And the rabbis are scratching their heads, and the rabbis are disagreeing. What happens if they touch things? What happens if they cook things? The rabbis are struggling with the issue of conversions for hundreds of years. And this is taking place during the Second Temple period. And in this week's portion, we have also a conversion that was done not exactly for the sake of heaven. What happens is that Shechem, Hamor, they have a desire to intermarry with the house of Jacob. So the house of Jacob presents their side of the deal, that if you want to become part of us, you need to circumcise, with that, which at that time represented a complete deal of conversion. They do it. They go through the circumcision. Mazel tov, they converted. Was it exactly for the sake of heaven? Was it for the right reason? Probably not. But it's interesting, again, this is a portion that deals with the return to the land of Israel, a return that is on a lower spiritual level return, a return that you need permission, and they're dealing with an issue of a conversion. Now, when they wiped out the city, when they wiped out the city of Shechem, after killing the residents who kidnapped their sister, they took goods with them until they reach a specific area, and Yaakov is inspired to build an altar, and he tells his family members, what do you do with all the pagan goods that you found in that city? Bury it. Bury it. Many, many years later, a few of those items, one of them was in the image of a dove, was found. One of those images that originated in Shechem was found. And a society began worshiping it. And we are told, the rabbis tell us that eventually the converts of the Second Temple period, the Kuthians, the converts who converted due to the fact that they were afraid of lions, eventually the rabbis were confident that their conversion is not for real, because a Dmut Yonah Matzu Lahem, there was a mountain that they worshipped, And the rabbis, after doing some research, found out that what they were really worshiping was an image of a dove. And this was an image that originated in the city of Shechem that, again, why did they convert? It wasn't for the sake of heaven. And therefore, many years later, in the Second Temple period, the rabbis sensed that their conversion was not, that they were not accepting the values and the teachings of Judaism. We see a very strong link again, because it's not just establishing a pattern, but rather the same objects that were in existence during the Shechem, during that conversion that was not for the sake of heaven, makes its reappearance right here in the during the period of the second Beit HaMikdash. This return of Yaakov Avinu, was one that we know very well that was not long-lasting. He had to eventually make his way down to Egypt, and the reason it was not long-lasting was the fact that the people of Israel didn't exactly get along. His children did not get along. They sold their brother. There was jealousy with their brother. And this, of course, is telling us the most important lesson, is that for Jews to make their way back, for Jews to be worthy of the land of Israel, and for Jews, of course, to return to the land of Israel, the only way to do so is feeling the responsibility towards another Jew. In other words, if we unite as a nation, then we will have the ability to succeed. The first thing, when they entered in the days of Yehoshua, what was their first stop? Their first stop was at two mountains. And what they did there was they came up with this pact of arvut. They established the concept of responsibility, that every Jew is responsible for another Jew, a message of unity. And my father used to explain that in the wilderness they lived on a supernatural level. The food came from heaven. Their clothes lasted for throughout the 40 years without dry cleaning. So this was a supernatural existence. They come into the land of Israel and they are extremely concerned. How will we survive? We no longer have these clouds of glory that protect us. We don't have this supernatural Moshe guiding us. What is the key for Jewish survival? So their first stop is a place where they become responsible for one another. Arvut, Jewish unity, is the way to survive. If we do not have that supernatural protection, the only way we could create an environment, the only tools we could put together for us to survive any challenge is Jewish unity. And that was the message that existed then, and that was the message and the flaw that unfortunately Yaakov saw among his children. And towards the end of the second temple period, we know very well from historical facts and from rabbinic facts that the Jews were just simply not getting along. People couldn't stand one another. If a Jew looked different, right, if he wore a different head covering, so you were for sure going to label him a heretic, because if he's not wearing exactly what I do, he's a heretic. It's too much to the right, too much to the left. That's how the world worked, and that's, of course, what we have to purge if we want to make our return to the land of Israel. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and have a good day.